In the last episode, after 14 years of brewing tension, things finally boiled over between Tokugawa Ieyasu and the heir to the old regime, Toyotomi Hideyori. For a time, things had been cordial yet stressful, as the two had engaged in a delicate game of political maneuvering. Yet their pleasantries could only last for so long, as it was clear that Ieyasu knew eventually he would have to deal with the Toyotomi heir. Using a convenient, if not a bit petty, excuse of a controversial and perhaps insulting inscription aimed at the Tokugawa on a new bell, Ieyasu called out Hideyori for his treachery, and thus their fragile relationship fell apart. Now, Ieyasu plans to march west to lay siege to Osaka and end the threat of Hideyori once and for all, while on the opposite side, many samurai and ronin from across the land have begun to flood into Osaka to defend the Toyotomi name in this last bitter struggle of Japan's warring era. "14 years. 14 years it had been. 14 years of peace. Despite his noble and victorious defense of his home castle, Ueda, during the Sekigahara conflict, Sanada Nobushige, known commonly today as Yukimura, was now in exile, living out the rest of his existence on Mount Koya in Ki province. His famous father, Sanada Masayuki, had too been sent into exile with him, as they had both chose to side against Tokugawa Ieyasu in the great climactic clash in 1600, while Sanada Nobuyuki, Yukimura's brother, had sided with the Tokugawa, to whom he was bound by marriage. Over the past decade, as Japan had been made to experience a new and unprecedented era of peace, it's hard to picture what thoughts might have flowed through Yukimura's mind. No doubt, there must have been some level of restlessness in his soul. A warrior by nature, he was now caged, trapped in a life he had been sent into without closure. As for his father, Masayuki, the old strategist, had carried on for some time with his son, until his death in 1611, at around the age of 64. Now, apart from his own son, Sanada Daisuke, Yukimura was alone. Yet in these lonesome days, he continued to correspond with his brother Nobuyuki, the proper head of the Sanada family under the rule of the new shogunate. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks to months, then years, it was clear there must still have been some longing in his heart, some desire to still have purpose, to not waste away and die slowly and peacefully in old age without the satisfaction of feeling one accomplished a great deed, or given his life in service of a noble cause. Although, by 1614 there were stirrings in the land, and whispers of the deteriorating peace were heard far and wide. The now retired shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was making his move to eliminate the last threat to his family's regime. He was preparing to destroy the Toyotomi heir in Osaka. As we have discussed in the previous episode, for some time the relationship between Ieyasu and Toyotomi Hideyori had been eroding, and finally, with the Hokoji Bell incident giving Ieyasu cause to call out the Toyotomi, renewed war was on the horizon. With the threat of violence looming, many samurai and ronin who had either been disenfranchised by the Tokugawa shogunate or were sympathetic to the Toyotomi cause had begun to emerge, making their way in droves to Osaka to defend the Toyotomi and take up arms against the shogun. There had been a general call for aid by Hideyori, and all those wishing to either support him, fight the Tokugawa, or simply wish to have past crimes forgiven were coming forth. And among them all would soon enough be Sanada Yukimura and his son Daisuke. In the east, the retired shogun, the great Tokugawa Ieyasu was preparing for his war, the final war he would ever likely see, or so he must have hoped. After the incident with the Hokoji Bell, which was marked by the inscription Ieyasu had interpreted to be a damning slight against him and his family, and now with the buildup of Toyotomi military power along with news of new defenses being constructed at Osaka, Ieyasu made ready to see his will be done. For too long he had allowed the Toyotomi heir to live on as a symbol of the old regime, as a beacon for those who would dare to stand against him. Now it was finally time to rid Japan of this threat, and to ensure the Tokugawa remained the supreme power in the land for generations to come. By October, he had received pledges of loyalty from up to 50 daimyo across the land, those who knew better than to side with the Toyotomi, those who were ready to fight on the shogun's behalf. Such names as Date, Uesugi, Honda, Mori, Maeda, Ikeda, Ii, Fukushima, Toro, Nabeshima, Sanada under Nobuyuki, and many, many more. As for Ieyasu's plan, it was little more than a straightforward siege, a full encirclement of the castle, where he would then strangle the Toyotomi war effort to death. Moving the Tokugawa main forces from Edo and Sumpu, he would link up with additional allies who would move to secure positions around Osaka and maintain their grip over other significant places such as Nijo in Kyoto and Fushimi. The main fear that must have still lingered on Ieyasu's mind was that with Osaka being one of the mightiest citadels in the entire country, a siege of it may last years. Flashbacks must have flooded into his memory of Oda Nobunaga's great siege of Ishiyama Honganji, the previous temple fortress which once sat where Osaka Castle did now, a siege which had lasted for an entire decade. Ieyasu must have dreaded a prolonged siege, being that he was getting older in age, now entering into his 70s. Time was not on his side. If he was going to finish things fast, he would need to assault the castle with all his might, and hope it breaks under his army's fist. By November, with his forces amassed and preparations made, Ieyasu set forth from his power base at Sumpu, while shortly thereafter, his son and the current shogun, Tokugawa Hidetada, along with other significant lords such as Date Masamune and Uesugi Kakekatsu, were to depart from Edo. With this, for the first time in over a decade, the grand armies of the Tokugawa and their allies marched west. Back in Osaka, Sanada Yukimura had arrived as a welcome addition to their growing coalition of Toyotomi loyalists. Among Hideyori's other notable supporters were that of Chosokabe Morichika, the son of the former lord of Tosa, the famous Chosokabe Motochika. There was also the Christian Akashi Takanori, a former Ukita clan strategist who had fought at Sekigahara. Another interesting figure is that of Goto Mototsugu, a former Kuroda clan samurai who had retired after the death of Kuroda Yoshitaka in 1604, but had now returned to active service to champion the Toyotomi heir. Lastly, I want to mention that of Ono Harunaga, one of the most significant leaders in Osaka. Harunaga had previously served on the Tokugawa side at the Battle of Sekigahara, but had in the years since secured a prominent position at Osaka, and had become close to the Toyotomi family. Surprisingly enough, in later years, stories and rumors have even arisen that Harunaga was having a secret love affair with Hideyori's own mother, the prominent and influential Yorodono. But this has never been confirmed and is often viewed as one of the many Edo period myths. After Katagiri Katsumoto, an important official in Osaka and mediator between the Tokugawa and Toyotomi, was removed from the castle under suspicion of treachery, as we had seen in the previous episode, Ono Harunaga had filled the void he had left and become one of the foremost leading Toyotomi figures. There were of course many more significant names who had entered Osaka and aligned themselves with the Toyotomi, but these figures, with the addition of Yukimura, formed a formidable high command. Sadly, their only issue would come to be a disagreement in how to best proceed. Osaka was a strong position, that was a certified fact, and with a growing force of over 100,000 to defend it, they stood a great chance to weather any siege the Tokugawa attempted, even given the understanding that Ieyasu would have twice as many men under his command. But to truly have any effect and actual chance at victory, the Toyotomi force would need to be proactive. They would need to be aggressive. To this end, Sanada Yukimura and Goto Mototsugu, who both clamored for an offensive strategy, proposed a daring plan. It was easy to assume that Ieyasu was going to try to encircle the castle, so to hinder his progress and prevent him from establishing a legitimate siege, the Osaka forces would set out to strike at key positions. What was of prime importance was the main highways which came from the east, the Tokaido and Nakasindo, the routes by which the Tokugawa and their allies would be marching towards Osaka. These two roads joined together just before Lake Biwa. If these paths could be blocked, it would slow or potentially even halt Ieyasu's progress. But this was only part of the effort. Other groups would be sent to secure Fushimi and the Nara Pass, while a significant contingent would need to march on Kyoto to seize the shogunate's Nijo castle within the imperial city and secure the emperor and the court. With the emperor in their hands, they could coerce him into declaring Ieyasu an enemy of the state. Thus, any wavering lords would surely switch sides to join the Toyotomi against the rebel shogunate. It was a bold and elaborate plan that, if successful, could cut Ieyasu off from reaching Osaka while also branding him as the real enemy. But it was dangerous and risky. If it took too long to complete, or if there ended up being significant casualties, it could jeopardize everything. And with this fear in mind, the naysayers within the highest war council in Osaka protested it, and thus to the dismay of Yukimura, Mototsugu, and those willing to take the fight to the Tokugawa. Instead, they would be made to hunker down, while Ieyasu was able to freely move in uncontested and able to completely surround the castle. No doubt, Sanada Yukimura would have found this notion foolish, to sit and wait to be strangled by the enemy, but he was still determined. His family was notorious for holding out in sieges, specifically against the Tokugawa. His father, Masayuki, would be remembered as one of the greatest strategists of the Sengoku period, and famously conducted 2 successful defenses of the Sanada's Ueda castle. For this, Yukimura had learned a great deal about how to hold out, especially against superior numbers. For the most part, much of the castle was very well defended, from not only its own walls, towers, and moats, but also natural defensive terrain that made it challenging to assault. But if there was one area that was troublesome, it was the exposed area along the southern flank, that if stormed, could be breached. To remedy this, the Toyotomi forces began digging ditches and an embankment. This would eventually take the form of a half-moon-shaped fortification, a stronghold along the outer castle walls, which can be classified as a barbican. It was from here Yukimura would be set to establish himself. It would be this fortification that would famously come to be known as the Sanada Maru. By December, as the winter had begun to set in, the shogunate had reached Osaka. With no attempt by Hideyori made to stand down and submit himself to the will of Ieyasu, fighting was to commence. The first major action Japan had seen since the Sekigahara conflict was a simple yet important attack on the 19th of December that occurred at the Kizugawa-guchi fort, located at the mouth of the Kizugawa River at the boundary of the castle town. It was a critical point held by Akashi Takanori, yet faced with a brutal assault by Hachisuka Yoshishige, the first blood would be shed. War had begun in Japan yet again. Aided by Asano and Ikeda forces, Yoshishige, through thick and fierce fighting, would smash his way through to claim the fort, while Takanori withdrew back to the safety of Osaka. No doubt this early victory must have sent a wave of optimism through the shogunal forces, that they may be capable of claiming swift victory over the Toyotomi loyalists. And over the coming days, the assaults continued as Tokugawa forces would manage to capture all of the outlying forts surrounding Osaka. Yet, they'd be met with intense counterattacks from the Osaka defenders. But despite this, by early January, the outer forts had been seized, and the shogunate had been able to resist attempts to retake them. Morale was recorded to have been low within Osaka Castle itself after continued losses, and attempts to rally the defenders were met with poor results. Still, the shogunate had yet to actually assault the castle itself, which would obviously be the largest challenge of them all. By this point, Ieyasu and Hidetada, feeling safe given their victories and positioning, advanced their main camps forward, with Ieyasu positioning himself atop a hill known as Chosuyama, and Hidetada at Okayama. In addition to this, the besieging shogunate army also began to dig in, entrenching their line around Osaka, while also building elaborate housing for their mighty war camp. Through this, they readied themselves for a prolonged siege. By January 3rd, Ieyasu and his High War Council correctly had determined that the weakest point to attack Osaka would be from the south, right where the Toyotomi forces had attempted to remedy this by expanding their ditches and constructing the Sanada Maru. It was this point that was decided to be where the Tokugawa would launch their first major assault against the castle. If successful in breaking through, the Toyotomi defenders were doomed. Yet the real strength of Osaka Castle had yet to be put to the test, despite all of the early successes Ieyasu had achieved thus far. At dawn, Maeda Toshitsune, leading a mighty contingent of soldiers, advanced towards the southern wall. The Osaka garrison had been alerted to his movements, and Sanada Yukimura, at the command of 5,000 men, hunkered down within the Sanada Maru to brace for impact. As soon as Maeda troops entered firing range, Sanada gunners let loose, raining bullets down onto the invaders. Those that did make it to the wall desperately attempted to climb, yet due to the smart placement of the Sanada Maru, additional Toyotomi troops from the other facing Osaka walls were able to shoot down at the Maeda soldiers trying to overtake the position. Slowly, some Maeda warriors began to break in, yet they were met by fierce Sanada defenders who quickly cut them down. In a very short amount of time, Maeda bodies were beginning to pile up, as hundreds were falling from bullet or by blade. The noise of battle, the screams of the dying and shouts of the wounded must have played out like a terrifying orchestra for those who had never experienced war before, while to other veterans of the Sengoku period, it must have been an all too familiar roar of violence. Having been completely battered, Maeda Toshitsune was forced to retreat. Yet the attack carried on as Ieyasu's grandson Matsudaira Tadanao came forth too to keep up the pressure. Additionally, with him was Ii Naotaka, who was leading the famous Ii Red Devils into battle. After numerous failed waves had thrown themselves at the Sanada Maru, they attempted to change their strategy and force their way further down towards the Hachomeguchi gateway, yet still met with guns blazing away at them and even a bold counterattack by Toyotomi defenders. They too were soon driven off. After a full day of fighting, Osaka had held firm. Yet these initial probes were far from done. The next day, the famous Toro Takatora, who had been recalled for service, launched a new attack to the west. It appears as though he was able to find more success than his allies the previous day, as he was able to break through. Yet his charge was not one that could be properly maintained, and soon enough a counterattack led by Chosokabe Morichika smashed into his lines and sent his men fleeing. Now it had been 2 full days of constant assaults, and all the shogunate forces had received was hundreds, if not thousands, of their own men dead. It must have been a sobering, but probably not totally unsurprising moment for Ieyasu, as he came to realize he would need to try alternative methods as opposed to simply storming the castle. Even his son Hidetada, who had at one point been in favor of launching an all-out assault on all sides, too came to realize the futility of such a notion. The defenders of Osaka would bleed them dry if the Tokugawa continued their attacks. And of course, what would have made things sting all the more for both Ieyasu and Hidetada was that one of the brave defenders who was now a thorn in their side was Sanada Yukimura, son of Masayuki, who had twice before beaten the Tokugawa at Ueda. The Sanada name must have been a bane for Ieyasu and his son, and one that resonated feelings of anger towards past failures against the Sanada family. Although Yukimura was not the main face of the opposition within Osaka, he was still a figure that would have given Ieyasu much grief, and was all the more reason as to why this siege may last much longer than he ever would have wanted. But there was one trick Ieyasu still had up his sleeve. For some time, aided by foreign figures such as William Adams, Ieyasu had been building up his stockpile of cannons. And now at Osaka, realizing the castle could not be taken by sheer force, he would at last choose to unleash them. Beginning on the 8th of January, Ieyasu ordered a limited bombardment to commence, firing off at around 10 o'clock at night and again at dawn the following day. The initial blast of the artillery must have been a terrifying sound, a loud and abrupt roar that would have startled and shocked all who could hear it. In fact, reports even indicate the noise of cannon fire being heard even as far away as Kyoto. For 3 days, this pattern of bombardment continued, as cannonballs rained haphazardly across the castle. The thing to remember about cannon fire at this point in time was that it was often not accurate, and in relation to this event here was more so just to be used as a tool of psychological warfare. And to further this, Ieyasu even ordered his men to raise war cries in between intervals of firing, as to keep the Osaka defenders always believing an attack was imminent. But still, even just to ensure things were completely covered, the Tokugawa also ordered miners to begin to dig a tunnel underneath the castle, should the bombardment fail. This may have even been what seemed like a more sound plan for a brief moment, as despite the devastating fire from incoming artillery, there was no response from the garrison, as the Toyotomi defenders continued to keep calm, or at least try to. This prompted Ieyasu by the 15th day of the month to order a full and consistent bombardment to begin. This he thought would surely cause the will of the defenders to break. Yet what he likely didn't anticipate was a violent response to come just the following day after the bombardment began. Likely wishing to show that he was unflinching in the face of the shelling, a Toyotomi samurai by the name of Ban Naotsugu launched a surprise attack at night. With his way lit only by the moon, his forces rushed out across the Honmachi Bridge and slammed into the line of Hachisuka Yoshishige. Quickly, an intense skirmish erupted in the darkness, one that the Shogunate forces had been unprepared for. This allowed Naotsugu and his forces to gain the upper hand before pulling back into the castle. All in all, they succeeded in humiliating the enemy and taking many heads, proving that the garrison was resilient as ever. Yet as the bombardment continued, an obvious division started to form within the castle. Those who wished to simply shrug it off and continue to hold out, and those who wanted to end the chaos and sue for some form of peace. Sanada Yukimura was obviously pro-war after his victorious defense of the Sanada Maru, and it appears that even for a time Toyotomi Hideyori had been unfazed by the bombardment as well. Yet pressure began to come from his mother, the influential Yorodono, after cannon fire had crashed into her quarters in the castle. But Yorodono was not alone in her calls for peace, as even Ono Harunaga had begun to float the idea too. Their position must have seemed too grim, and with Tokugawa forces continuing to call for the surrender of Osaka, many must have slowly begun to consider a peaceful end to the violence. Such a notion would have been met with anger by Yukimura and those who sought to continue the fight. Yet with both Yorodono and Ono Harunaga both having their claws deep into Hideyori, it did not take long for him to give in. By late January, peace negotiations were held, and they, like many peace negotiations throughout the Sengoku period, were a bit of a fiasco. Initially, Ieyasu's offer to move Hideyori to a secure provincial location was shot down, because, let's face it, he was just going to be put in a place where he could be more easily controlled. This was then followed up by a plea by Hideyori to move to Shikoku, which was also then shot down. Hideyori is even said to have made some bold and almost uncharacteristic remarks about wishing to make the castle his tomb if need be. But in the end, it was finally agreed that he would be allowed to remain in Osaka, and that his income would not change. Additionally, he and his mother would be made to swear to never rebel again, but also that all the samurai and ronin who had supported the Toyotomi would be forgiven. Of course, within the Osaka High Command, many protested the settlement, as those who were inclined to continue the fight were disgusted to have surrendered and were uneasy in dealing with Ieyasu, who they did not trust. It is even said that Goto Mototsugu, who was very pro-war, had petitioned to change the Osaka leadership and that Sanada Yukimura would be the obvious choice for a proper supreme commander of the Toyotomi forces. But it goes without saying that this notion from Mototsugu did not come to fruition. The true controversy came after the end of the winter siege on the 21st of December, when the Tokugawa army stood down, and then took up shovels, axes, and picks, with which they then converged upon the castle. It had not been part of the agreement that any of Osaka's defenses were to be dismantled, so that when Tokugawa forces began to tear down the walls of the great citadel and fill in the moats, Hideyori and other Toyotomi commanders came out yelling and protesting. But their complaints fell upon deaf ears. It was true, Ieyasu could not be trusted. Dismantling the castle's defenses was not part of the deal he had signed and stamped with his own blood. But he did not care. By this point, he was already on his way back east, having reported to the emperor that the conflict was over and that the peace had been maintained. And finally, when he did choose to respond to Hideyori, he simply stated that with peace secured, castle walls were no longer needed. Of course, as we know, this peace would be short-lived. The battle for Osaka was not done yet. So, what can we learn so far? By 1614, the siege of Osaka began as the retired shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, led a massive force to lay siege to the Toyotomi heir. Initially, the shogunate's forces would see success in capturing a number of key forts around Osaka. Yet once the main assault of the walls began, the tide quickly turned, with many valiant figures such as Sanada Yukimura defending the Toyotomi name. The Tokugawa forces were continually bloodied and repelled. This prompted Ieyasu to resort to more drastic measures, using cannons to fire away at the castle, while miners began to tunnel underneath. Yet despite a brief and successful counterattack by the Toyotomi forces, the cannons did their work, and soon enough, Toyotomi Hideyori was pressured to begin peace negotiations. After a peace conference, those who were pro-war and against negotiating with Ieyasu were proven right, as the Tokugawa forces began to tear down the walls of Osaka. In the next episode, the war for Osaka starts anew as the summer siege begins in what will become the all-out epic finale of Japan's Warring States era. A legendary clash that will bring the period to its climactic close. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.